The kingdom did not fall in war, it fell in silence. The Alpha King was gone, betrayed by his own council, poisoned in his own throne room, and erased from history like he never existed. The pack believed he was dead, and so they began rewriting the kingdom. They called the weak useless. They threw the crippled Omega beyond the sacred border, into the frozen wilderness where no wolf survives. She was supposed to die there, but in the snow, something impossible happened. 4 royal wolves emerged from the forbidden forest, creatures that only obey one name, the true Alpha King. And instead of killing her, they bowed. Far beneath the kingdom, in a place sealed for centuries, the Alpha King opened his eyes for the first time in months. Because for the first time, something had broken through his silence. A broken Omega. A girl who should not exist in his world. But the moment his wolves escorted her into the forbidden sanctuary, everything changed. The kingdom above continues to celebrate his death, while beneath them, the real Alpha King is waking up. And this time, he is not returning to rule. He is returning to end everything. The only question is, how did a crippled Omega become the key to the fall of an entire empire? The frozen river screamed before the sky did. Ice cracked like broken bones stretching across a dying world, splitting the northern valley into jagged pieces of white chaos. Wind howled through the shattered landscape, as if the kingdom itself was mourning something it had not yet understood. Beneath the collapsing surface of the water, massive shadows moved violently, trapped and suffocating under the crushing weight of freezing death. 12 giant wolves of the Royal Alpha Legion were drowning slowly, their bodies dragging under the ice, claws scraping helplessly against invisible walls of solid water. Each movement sent shockwaves through the river, but none were strong enough to break the prison that had swallowed them. Above the chaos, armored warriors stood frozen in hesitation. Not from fear of the wolves, but from the silence of command that had betrayed them. The royal escort had been attacked from within. No enemy banner had crossed the border. No rival army had been seen approaching. The destruction had come from trusted hands. That realization hung heavier than the freezing air itself. Somewhere behind the lines, the Alpha King was supposed to be protected. Instead, his presence had vanished from the battlefield like a ghost swallowed by betrayal. Deep inside the collapsing river system, one of the wolves let out a low, broken sound that barely reached the surface. It was not just pain. It was recognition of death approaching without mercy. The ice above it pulsed with cracks widening like veins of a dying beast. The water beneath churned violently, pulling everything downward into darkness. The wolves were not ordinary creatures. They were extensions of the Alpha King's will, bound to his presence, trained to move like living shadows of his authority. And now they were being erased one by one. Far away from the political collapse and hidden treachery, the edge of the frozen forest remained untouched by war. There, a young woman moved through the snow with quiet urgency. Her hands were red from cold, her breath visible in slow trembling waves, but her steps never hesitated. She was known only to the small settlements scattered along the northern wilderness, a figure of compassion where survival usually erased mercy. She had no army, no protection, no title that the world would respect. Yet she moved toward the sound of destruction, as if something inside her refused to accept silence as an answer. When she reached the river, she stopped. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood instinctively that what she was seeing was not natural disaster. It was engineered collapse. The ice was breaking in controlled patterns. The water currents were forced, directed. Something had been trapped below on purpose. Her eyes followed the shifting cracks until she saw movement beneath the surface. Massive shapes twisting, struggling, fading. Without waiting for understanding to form fully in her mind, she stepped onto the ice. It groaned under her weight, warning her with deep cracking sounds that echoed across the valley. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back. But something deeper pulled her forward, something that felt like recognition without memory. The first wolf broke through the ice near her feet, half conscious, its body dragged upward by sheer force of desperation. Its fur was soaked, its breathing unstable, its eyes flickering between life and collapse. She did not hesitate. She grabbed its massive shoulder and pulled with all her strength. The ice resisted like a living enemy. Her hands slipped, her knees sank into freezing water, but she refused to let go. With one final pull, the wolf collapsed onto the surface, gasping violently as air returned to its lungs. One by one, she began to pull them out. Each rescue drained something from her body. Each wolf was heavier than the last, not just in weight but in presence. They were not ordinary beasts. There was an unnatural intensity in their aura, as if each one carried fragments of a greater will. The ice beneath her fractured further with every movement. Time itself felt unstable in that place, stretched between survival and collapse. Far above, hidden watchers observed from the edge of the treeline. They did not intervene. They did not reveal themselves. Their armor was marked with symbols of the new regime that had already begun to rise in the capital. They were not here to save anyone. They were here to ensure nothing survived that could challenge the new order. Their attention sharpened as they saw the woman pulling out the wolves. Not because she was helping them, but because she was interfering with something they had already decided should end. As the ninth wolf was dragged from the ice, the wind shifted. A deep pressure rolled across the valley, subtle but undeniable. The remaining wolves beneath the water began to react differently, not with panic, but with awareness. As if something inside them had changed. The woman felt it too. A weight in the air that pressed against her chest, making every breath slightly harder. The final wolf beneath the ice was still unconscious, but something about its presence was different from the others. The water around it was darker, denser, almost unwilling to release it. She knelt at the edge of the broken ice and looked down. For the first time, hesitation entered her movement. The shape beneath the surface was larger than the rest. Its presence was not just physical but symbolic, like the river itself was resisting its removal. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the freezing water again. The cold bit into her skin with unnatural force, as if the water was trying to reject her entirely. She wrapped her arms around the massive form and pulled. The moment she touched it, something strange happened. A pulse. Not from the river. From the wolf itself. A deep, faint reaction that echoed through her body like a memory she had never lived. Her breath caught, but she forced herself forward. The ice cracked violently around them, the pressure increasing as if the world itself was collapsing inward to stop her. With one final desperate motion, she dragged the wolf onto the surface. It lay still. Too still. The others had moved. This one did not. She leaned closer, checking for breath, unaware that she was now kneeling beside something the entire kingdom believed was already gone. The Alpha King had been declared dead in the capital days ago. A betrayal had erased his existence from official record. His throne had already been claimed by those who stood closest to him. But here, beneath frozen wind and shattered ice, the truth had not died. It was breathing quietly beneath a wolf's body. And as the woman placed her hands on his chest to feel for life, the world around her seemed to pause for the first time since the river began to break. Far away in the capital, the new Alpha throne was being raised. And in that exact moment, the last surviving wolf opened its eyes. Not as an animal, but as something far more dangerous, remembering it had once been a king. The ice beneath the woman's knees cracked one final time, deeper than before, as if answering a name no one had spoken aloud yet. The night did not feel like night anymore. It felt like something heavier had settled over the world, as if the sky itself had lowered its head in silence. Deep inside the frozen forest, the wind no longer moved freely. It pressed against the trees like an invisible force trying to listen to something buried beneath the earth. Somewhere far from the broken river, life had begun again in silence, but it was not the same life that had existed before the ice collapsed. The young woman moved through the snow with exhausted steps, carrying the weight of survival she did not fully understand. Behind her, the rescued wolves followed, without sound. Not as animals driven by instinct, but as beings drawn to something deeper in her presence. Their eyes never left the unconscious final wolf she had dragged from the frozen river. It lay on a wooden sled made from broken forest branches, its massive body still unmoving, still resisting the idea of returning to life. She had not spoken since leaving the river. Not because there was nothing to say, but because every breath felt heavier than the last. Something about the final wolf stayed inside her mind like a shadow she could not shake. The moment she touched it, the world had reacted. A pulse she could not explain had passed through her body, leaving behind a strange emptiness, as if part of her awareness had been momentarily pulled into something else. The forest village appeared slowly through the falling snow. Small wooden shelters, half buried in white silence, barely held against the northern cold. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys like fading signals of survival. People inside those homes lived unaware of the storm that had just passed beyond the river. To them, the world remained simple. Life, hunger, survival. Nothing beyond that. But the woman knew something had changed. She brought the sled to the edge of the settlement and stopped. The wolves did not move forward immediately. They watched the village with caution, as if they were entering a place that did not belong to them anymore. The final wolf remained still, its chest barely rising, its presence heavy in a way that did not match its condition. Even unconscious, it felt like something that should not be placed on the ground of ordinary lives. An old healer from the village approached slowly, noticing the massive shapes behind her. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he saw the injured wolves. "This is dangerous," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of fear more than authority. "These are not normal beasts. You should not have brought them here." The woman did not respond immediately. Her hands were still trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper she could not name. She looked at the final wolf again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something beneath its fur. "I did not choose this," she finally said. "It was already happening when I found them." The healer stepped closer, studying the unconscious creature. The others reacted instantly, shifting their positions between him and the wolf as if protecting it without instruction. That reaction alone made the old man step back. "These are not wild animals," he whispered. "They are bound. I can feel it." The woman did not understand what he meant, but she felt the truth in his words anyway. There was something unnatural in the silence of the final wolf. Not emptiness, but controlled absence. As if its presence had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of existence. Inside the village, word spread quickly. Strangers bringing massive wolves into a settlement was not something that could remain unnoticed. People gathered at a distance, watching from behind wooden walls and half-closed doors. Fear and curiosity moved together through the crowd, but no one dared approach too closely. The woman placed the sled near a fire pit outside the healer's shelter. Warm light flickered across the snow, revealing the deep injuries of the wolves more clearly. The others had begun to recover slowly, their breathing steadier, their bodies reacting to warmth. But the final wolf remained unchanged. It did not respond to heat. It did not respond to movement. It did not respond to life. Only silence surrounded it, deeper than anything she had ever seen. As night deepened, the village settled into uneasy stillness. The wolves lay close together, forming a protective circle around the unconscious one. The woman sat nearby, watching without realizing she had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment the river cracked open. Not the destruction, but the feeling beneath it. A presence that had reacted to her touch. Hours passed before the first sign appeared. A faint shift in the final wolf's breathing. So subtle that she almost missed it. Then another. The air around it grew heavier, not physically, but emotionally. The kind of pressure that made thoughts slow down without explanation. The wolves around it lifted their heads at the same time, sensing the change before anyone else could. The woman leaned forward slightly. Something was happening. The healer, who had been observing from a distance, froze as he noticed the change as well. His expression darkened with something close to recognition, though he could not explain why. "This should not be possible," he muttered. "Not after what it endured." The final wolf's chest rose again, this time more firmly. A slow return to breath that did not feel natural, but deliberate, as if something inside it had chosen to begin again. The woman moved closer without thinking. Her hand hovered above its fur, uncertain whether to touch it again. The moment she did, the reaction returned. That same pulse from the river, weaker now, but undeniable. It traveled through her arm, up her spine, and settled somewhere deep in her awareness. Her breath stopped. This time she saw something. Not a vision, not a memory, but a feeling of a vast space collapsing inward. A throne made of silence. A voice that had never been spoken but had always commanded. And beneath it all, a presence that refused to disappear even after being erased. She pulled her hand back quickly, shaken. The wolves around her stood up. Not aggressively, but in recognition. The healer stepped forward now, his fear replaced by something sharper. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "it is not what it appears to be." At that exact moment, the final wolf moved. Not fully awake, but enough. Its claws pressed slightly into the ground beneath it. Snow around its body trembled, as if responding to pressure that came from within rather than outside. Its head tilted faintly, struggling against unconsciousness, but not in weakness, in resistance. And then, for the first time since the river collapse, its eyes opened halfway. Not looking at the woman, not looking at the village, but staring into something far beyond it. The entire group froze. Because in that single half-open gaze, there was no animal left. Only something buried beneath identity, struggling to return. Far away in the capital, unseen by anyone in the village, banners rose above the palace walls announcing a new alpha authority. And at the exact same moment, the final wolf finally inhaled fully for the first time. Not as a survivor, but as something remembering it had once ruled death itself. And the woman realized too late that she had not saved a wolf from the river. She had pulled something back into the world that the entire kingdom had already decided should never return. The snow outside the village began to fall harder, as if the sky itself had recognized the beginning of something it could no longer prevent. The silence inside the forest broke like a living thing snapping under pressure. Snow stopped falling for a moment, as if even the sky had paused to witness what was emerging from beneath forgotten death. Inside the small village, every breath felt heavier, every sound sharper. The final wolf no longer lay like a broken creature. Its body had changed in subtle but terrifying ways. Not in shape but in presence. The air around it felt compressed, as though reality itself was adjusting to something returning that had once been removed from it. The young woman stood motionless beside the fire pit, her eyes fixed on the creature that had already begun to defy explanation. The wolves around it no longer behaved like rescued animals. They stood in alignment, not by instinct but by recognition. Something inside them had awakened at the same rhythm, a shared awareness that had nothing to do with survival anymore. It was obedience returning to its source. The healer had stepped back completely now. His face had lost all color. Years of living in isolation, studying wounds and survival, had never prepared him for something that felt like authority without movement. "This is not recovery," he whispered. "This is return." The woman did not respond. Her mind was still trapped in the memory of the river, in that strange pulse that had passed through her body the moment she touched the final wolf. She had tried to ignore it, tried to explain it as shock or exhaustion. But it was no longer something she could dismiss. Something inside her had changed the moment she pulled it from the water. The final wolf shifted again. This time, the movement was not uncertain. It was controlled. Its claws pressed into the snow and pushed slightly forward. The motion was small, but it carried weight that made the surrounding air feel unstable. The wolves around it lowered their heads slowly, not in fear, but in alignment. The village, which had been whispering moments earlier, fell into complete silence. The healer moved closer again, despite his fear. "There are old stories," he said carefully. "Stories buried under northern winters. They speak of wolves that are not wolves. They speak of bodies used as vessels when kings are erased from existence. But those are stories meant to scare children." His voice faltered as the final wolf lifted its head slightly higher. The woman stepped forward without thinking. Something about it was pulling her closer again, the same force she had felt at the river. Not physical attraction, but something deeper. A recognition she could not place. Her instincts warned her to stop, but her body ignored them. The final wolf opened its eyes fully. And everything changed. The moment its gaze settled into the world, the atmosphere inside the village collapsed inward. Not violently, but completely. The wolves around it lowered themselves further, as if responding to something absolute. The healer stumbled backward, unable to maintain balance under the pressure of presence alone. The woman froze, because those eyes were not empty. They were aware, not of the village, not of her, but of something far beyond all of it, as if consciousness had returned from a place that normal thought could not follow. A low breath escaped the creature's throat, deeper than anything an animal should have been capable of producing. The sound carried through the snow and settled into every corner of the settlement, like a command that did not need words. The woman felt it again, that pulse. But stronger now. It did not just pass through her body this time. It aligned with it. Her breathing slowed without intention. Her thoughts sharpened without effort. Something inside her mind briefly touched a structure that did not belong to her, and then withdrew before she could understand it. The final wolf rose halfway from the ground. Snow fell from its fur like fragments of a broken illusion. The movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply unnatural in its control. It did not look like recovery. It looked like reconstruction. The healer whispered something under his breath, but no one heard him clearly. His voice was lost under the weight of realization forming too slowly in his mind. The wolves around the final one suddenly shifted again. Their alignment changed from submission to formation. Not random movement, but organized positioning, as if responding to invisible command lines that had suddenly become active again after being dormant for too long. The woman stepped back instinctively. The fire behind her flickered violently, even though no wind had moved through the village. The final wolf turned its head slightly toward her. Anne paused. For the first time, its gaze focused on something specific. Her. The connection was not emotional. It was not familiar in a human sense. It was recognition at a level deeper than identity. Something inside it acknowledged her presence not as rescuer or stranger, but as the point through which return had become possible. The woman's breath became uneven. Her chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from pressure she could not explain. Her knees weakened slightly, as if the ground beneath her was no longer fully stable. The healer finally spoke, voice trembling. "Step away." But she could not move. The final wolf stood fully now. Its body was no longer collapsing under injury or exhaustion. It stood as something reassembled, something that had reclaimed structure after being dissolved. The surrounding wolves lowered themselves completely, their heads touching the snow, forming a silent circle of submission. The village itself felt smaller now, not physically but in presence, as if something had expanded within it that made everything else feel secondary. The final wolf took one slow step forward. The snow beneath its paw did not break. It held, as if the ground itself had decided not to resist it anymore. The woman's mind flashed briefly with fragments she did not understand. A throne without shape. A river of frozen silence. A voice that had once commanded armies without needing sound. She could not hold the images long enough to interpret them, but they left behind emotional weight that made her chest ache. The final wolf stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel its breath. But instead of hostility, there was stillness. Deep, controlled stillness. Then something impossible happened. The wolf's eyes shifted slightly, not away from her, but through her, as if looking beyond the physical world she occupied. The healer dropped to one knee without realizing it. The villagers watching from afar began to retreat instinctively, unable to explain the fear rising in them. And then the final wolf exhaled slowly. The sound was not loud, but it carried meaning. The woman's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. When it cleared, something had changed again. Not in the world, but in perception. She suddenly understood that what stood before her was not simply recovering. It was remembering. And memory in something like this was not passive. It was return of authority. The final wolf tilted its head slightly, as if testing the boundary between past and present. The wolves around it remained frozen in submission. Even the wind outside the village slowed, as if waiting for direction. The healer's voice broke the silence again, weaker now. Whatever this is, it is not finished waking up. The woman felt her hands tremble, because she realized something she had not been willing to consider until now. If this was not finished waking up, then what she had pulled from the river was not a survivor. It was something paused, something waiting, something that had not yet decided what it would become again. The final wolf's gaze sharpened slightly, and in that moment, far beyond the forest, in the distant capital where a false throne had already been raised, the newly crowned rulers suddenly felt a shift they could not explain. As if something they believed was gone had just opened its eyes again. And the woman standing in the snow realized the truth too late. She had not rescued a dying creature. She had restarted something the entire kingdom had already tried to erase. The final wolf took another step forward, and the air itself seemed to wait for what it would become next. The capital burned in silence before it burned in fire. Not real fire at first, but the fire of authority collapsing into chaos. The banners of the new regime had already been raised across the highest towers, yet something beneath them was beginning to rot. Guards moved through the palace corridors with forced confidence, but their footsteps no longer carried certainty. Every sound inside the royal structure felt slightly delayed, as if the building itself was reacting too slowly to something it could not yet see. At the center of the throne hall, the new alpha ruler sat beneath a crown that did not feel like his own. It had been placed on his head by advisors who spoke too quickly and smiled too carefully. The throne had once belonged to a king who ruled without hesitation. Now it belonged to men who ruled through fear of absence rather than strength of presence. But something was wrong. It began as a feeling, a pressure in the air that did not belong to the room. The advisors noticed it first, though none of them spoke about it. Their eyes drifted toward the tall windows of the hall, where the frozen horizon of the north stretched endlessly. The same horizon where the old king had supposedly died. The same horizon they had stopped thinking about too quickly. Then the guards outside the palace gates began to report disturbances. Not invasions. Not armies. Something worse. Silence moving against them. In the frozen forest far from the capital, the transformation had already begun. The final wolf stood motionless in the snow, but the world around it no longer treated it like a creature. The air itself felt structured around its presence. The woman stood several steps away now, her body tense, her instincts torn between stepping forward and running. The healer had retreated completely, unable to maintain composure under what he could no longer rationalize. The wolves that had been rescued no longer behaved like wounded animals. They had formed a silent perimeter, not as protection, but as recognition. As if something ancient had been restored in front of them, and they had remembered their place within it. The final wolf took another step forward. The snow did not resist. The woman's breath tightened as she felt the pressure in the air increase again. It was not physical weight. It was something closer to authority returning layer by layer into the world. Every instinct she had told her to step back, but something deeper prevented her from moving. The wolf stopped directly in front of her again, this time closer, and then it lowered its head slightly, not in submission, not in weakness, but in recognition of alignment. The woman's mind fractured briefly under the sensation. She saw flashes again. Not visions she could control, but impressions that did not belong to human understanding. A battlefield covered in silence. A river breaking under impossible weight. A throne room filled with people kneeling without being ordered. Her knees weakened slightly. The healer finally spoke, his voice trembling. "It is not becoming a wolf anymore." The woman did not respond, because she already knew. Something inside it was reorganizing itself beyond physical form. The presence she felt was no longer fragmented. It was stabilizing. The final wolf lifted its head again, and the air changed completely. The wolves behind it all lowered themselves at once. Not in reaction, in synchronization. The village beyond the clearing began to feel it too. Doors slowly opened. People stepped outside, without understanding why. Something in their bodies responded before their minds could interpret it. A presence that demanded awareness. The final wolf took one slow breath. And when it exhaled, something invisible spread outward through the forest. The woman felt it pass through her again. But this time it did not leave confusion. It left certainty. Her eyes widened slightly as realization formed fully. This was not a recovery. This was activation. Far away, in the capital, the reaction began instantly. The throne room lights flickered once. Not from wind. From imbalance. The advisors turned toward each other, sensing something shift in the foundation of their control. The crowned ruler stood slightly, his expression tightening as a strange pressure entered the hall. Outside the palace, guards froze mid-movement. Because from the northern horizon, something was coming that could not be measured in distance or time. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to change again. Not physically in a visible way at first, but in the way it occupied space. The air around it felt denser. The silence around it felt controlled rather than empty. Even the wind seemed to adjust its path subtly around its presence. The woman stepped back one more time, finally breaking the paralysis. But she was too late to escape what was already unfolding. The final wolf's eyes closed. And for a brief moment, absolute stillness covered everything. The forest, the village, the capital far away, even the wind itself seemed to pause. Then it opened its eyes again. And the world responded. Not loudly. Not violently. But completely. The pressure that had been building since the river collapsed finally reached its peak. The final wolf no longer looked like a recovering creature. It looked like something returning to its rightful state. The healer fell to his knees without understanding why. The woman's breath became shallow as she felt the truth settle fully into her awareness. This was not just a surviving beast. This was a command structure reassembling itself. And she had been standing too close to it the entire time. The final wolf turned its head slightly. And for the first time, it looked past her completely. As if something else had arrived. Something that did not belong to the forest. The woman followed its gaze instinctively. And that was when she felt it too. Not sound. Not sight. But presence. Something approaching from far beyond the village. Something that made the air itself feel like it was preparing for judgment. The wolves around her stood again in perfect alignment. The healer whispered, barely audible. It is not just waking. It is being followed. The woman's heart tightened, because she understood what that meant without needing explanation. Whatever she had pulled from the river was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. Something that had already started moving before she even realized it existed. The final wolf took one step forward again. And this time the ground beneath it responded. Snow shifted outward in a perfect circle, as if the world itself had acknowledged its return. And then, for the first time since the river, a sound broke through the silence. Not from the wolf, not from the forest, but from the distant direction of the capital. A signal horn, followed by another. And another. The woman turned sharply toward the sound. The healer's face went pale. Because those horns were not warnings. They were recognition signals used only when something classified as impossible had been detected approaching the kingdom. The final wolf stood still. And in that stillness, something inside it finally aligned completely. The woman felt it before she understood it. A shift. Not in emotion. Not in behavior. But in identity. And then the final wolf took one last step forward. Its presence expanded silently across the forest, across the snow, across distance itself. And the woman realized the truth with a cold clarity that made her chest tighten. She had not saved the last wolf. She had brought back something the entire kingdom had already declared dead. And somewhere far away, the throne that had been stolen began to feel something it had never been designed to withstand. The gates of the capital trembled before they even opened. Not from siege engines, not from armies, but from something far more unsettling. The guards stationed at the outer walls felt it first. A pressure in the air that did not belong to weather or war. The snow beyond the horizon had begun to fall differently, as if even nature was adjusting its rhythm to something approaching from beyond comprehension. Inside the palace, the false alpha ruler stood again, his crown suddenly heavier than it had been moments before. The throne room no longer felt stable. Conversations among advisors slowed, then stopped entirely. Every instinct inside them began to warn of something they could not yet name. Then the first report arrived. The northern forests had gone silent. Completely. No movement. No wildlife. No wind patterns behaving naturally. As if something had passed through and taken control of even silence itself. The false ruler ordered denial before fear could take shape, but his voice did not carry authority anymore. It carried uncertainty. And uncertainty was something the capital had not experienced since the original Alpha King had vanished. Far beyond the walls, in the frozen wilderness, the woman stood frozen in place. The final wolf no longer looked like a creature bound to the earth. It stood as if the world itself had adjusted its rules around its existence. The wolves that once followed instinct now stood in formation, not as animals, but as extensions of something larger returning to awareness. The healer had already retreated into silence, unable to reconcile what he was witnessing. His entire understanding of life, healing, and nature had collapsed under the weight of something that should not exist. The woman's breathing was shallow. Every instinct in her body screamed that she was standing too close to something she could not survive if it fully awakened. Yet she did not move. Something inside her refused to retreat, as if her own existence had become tied to what was unfolding before her. The final wolf took one step forward, and the snow beneath it responded like it had been waiting, not breaking, not resisting, just accepting. The air grew heavier again, not physically, but in a way that made thought itself feel slower. The woman's vision sharpened painfully, every detail becoming more defined as if reality itself was preparing to record what was about to happen. The wolf stopped and lifted its head toward the distant horizon. The capital. The woman followed its gaze and felt it too. Not sight, not sound, presence. A force moving across the land, like a memory returning to something that had forgotten it once belonged to it. The healer whispered weakly, "It is not here. It is coming." The woman's heart tightened because she finally understood the scale of what she had triggered. This was no longer about survival or recovery. It was about convergence. Something had begun in the river, passed through the forest, and was now reaching outward into the world itself. The final wolf closed its eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, everything changed. The capital's gates slammed shut on their own. Not by command, by reaction. Inside the throne room, the false ruler stepped back as the massive doors of the palace began to tremble. The advisors finally lost all composure, moving toward exits that no longer felt safe. The guards outside the throne room tightened their grip on weapons they suddenly did not believe would be enough. Then it arrived. Not physically at first, but in awareness. A pressure so complete it felt like identity itself was being evaluated by something older than authority. The false alpha ruler's crown slipped slightly, just enough to make him realize he was no longer the center of anything. And then the doors opened. Slowly. Not broken. Not forced. Just opened. As if the structure itself had decided resistance was no longer relevant. A wind passed through the throne hall. But it was not wind. It carried memory. And with it, recognition. Every guard inside the hall froze as their bodies responded before their minds could process what they were seeing. At the entrance stood a figure. Not fully defined at first. Not fully human in presence, but undeniable in authority. The return had begun. Back in the forest, the final wolf opened its eyes again. But this time, there was no hesitation. No instability. Only clarity. The woman felt her breath stop completely as she realized the alignment had finished. What stood before her was no longer a recovering creature. It was something reassembled. Something restored. The wolves around it lowered their heads once more, but now the gesture carried finality instead of uncertainty. The healer collapsed fully to the ground, unable to remain standing under the pressure of what his mind could no longer process. The woman's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The final wolf did not respond in words. It did not need to, because the world itself began to respond for it. Far away, in the capital, the false ruler fell from his throne. Not from force. From recognition collapse. Because the presence now filling the throne room was no longer something he could pretend did not exist. The advisors backed away as the figure stepped forward. And with each step, the illusion of stolen authority fractured further. Outside the palace, the skies shifted. Snow began to fall in reverse motion for a brief moment, as if time itself had misaligned in confusion. Inside the throne room, the figure stopped at the base of the throne and lifted its gaze. The false ruler could not speak, could not command, could only understand that everything he had built was standing on borrowed absence. And absence had just ended. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to shift again. But this time, it was not transformation. It was revelation. The woman stumbled back as the air itself tightened, because she finally saw it, not through vision, not through memory, but through certainty that struck deeper than understanding. The presence she had been interacting with was not a beast, not a creature, not even a survivor. It was something that had been stripped of identity and forced into silence. And silence had finally ended. The final wolf took one step forward. And in that step, everything aligned. The capital, the forest, the river, the memory of betrayal, the collapse of a kingdom. All of it converged into a single returning truth. The woman fell to her knees without realizing why, because her body understood before her mind accepted it. The final wolf was no longer just awakening. It was reclaiming. And somewhere far away, in the collapsing throne room, the false ruler finally heard it. Not sound, not voice, but identity returning to the world. The Alpha King had come back, and the kingdom that thought it had replaced him was about to learn what it meant to exist under the rule of something that had never truly left. The final wolf turned its gaze toward the woman one last time, and for the first time, there was no confusion in its eyes, only certainty, as if it now remembered everything. And then, in the silence that followed, the air itself seemed to bow. But somewhere deep inside the returning presence, something even more dangerous began to surface. Not revenge, not anger, but judgment. And the woman realized, too late, that what she had saved from the river was not returning to be grateful. It was returning to decide what the world was still allowed to be. The snow fell harder over the forest. The world did not celebrate when the Alpha King returned. It trembled. The first sound was not war horns or royal proclamation. It was silence collapsing under its own weight. Inside the capital, the throne room no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like something hollow had been filled with something it could not contain. The false ruler lay beneath shattered steps of authority, his crown broken beside him, his ambition reduced to something small and unrecognizable. No one spoke, not because they were ordered to remain silent, but because speech itself felt unnecessary in the presence that now filled the hall. The Alpha King stood at the base of the throne, no longer in the form of a beast, no longer trapped between memory and instinct. The transformation was complete, but it was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, as if reality had corrected a mistake it had been carrying for too long. Every guard in the hall felt it at the same time. Their weapons lowered without command. Their bodies reacted before their minds could resist. The weight of presence alone was enough to dissolve resistance that had been built over years of fear and loyalty to false power. The Alpha King did not rush forward. He did not need to. The throne itself felt smaller as he approached it, not physically but in meaning. What once represented absolute authority now looked like something temporary, something borrowed, something that had been sitting in the dark, pretending to matter. He placed one hand on the arm of the throne, and for a brief moment, the entire structure of the capital reacted, not breaking, not collapsing, but acknowledging. The stone beneath the palace shifted slightly, like the kingdom itself was adjusting to the return of its original center. Outside, the skies above the capital changed color in a way no one could explain. Snow that had been falling for days began to move differently, slower, heavier, as if gravity itself had become uncertain. Inside the forest far away, the woman stood frozen. She had not followed the events of the capital physically, but she had felt them. Every shift, every collapse, every return. The final wolf no longer stood in front of her as a mystery. It stood as something complete. Its eyes were calm now, but not empty. They carried the stillness of something that had already finished becoming what it was meant to be. The wolves around it no longer moved. They simply existed in alignment, as if the forest itself had accepted a new order without resistance. The healer finally spoke, his voice weak and broken. "It is over." But the woman did not answer, because something inside her refused to accept that word. Over meant ending, and what she was sensing did not feel like an ending. It felt like conclusion. In the capital, the Alpha King finally turned away from the throne, not because he rejected it, but because he no longer needed to question it. The advisors who had once controlled the false ruler now stood in complete silence. Some had already fallen to their knees without realizing it. Others simply stared, unable to process how quickly the structure of power had dissolved around them. The Alpha King moved forward through the hall. Each step did not demand obedience. It created it. The guards parted without instruction. The path opened without resistance. Not because fear controlled them, but because recognition had replaced confusion. Something inside them remembered what authority actually felt like, and everything false became unbearable in comparison. As he passed through the hall, fragments of the past began to settle into place within the kingdom's memory. Betrayal was no longer hidden. Lies no longer held structure. Every manipulation that had built the false regime began to collapse under its own exposure. But the Alpha King did not stop to punish anyone yet. His presence alone was enough to undo what had been constructed in his absence. Outside the palace gates, the city reacted in waves. People stepped into streets without understanding why they were drawn there. Something in the air had changed. Something that could not be explained but could not be ignored. The return had become undeniable. Back in the forest, the woman finally stepped closer to the final wolf. Her hand moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of understanding that whatever stood before her was no longer uncertain. The moment her fingers touched its fur again, there was no shock this time. No overwhelming pulse. Only recognition, not of the creature, but of the connection it carried. Her breath steadied slightly as she realized something that made her chest tighten in a different way. She had not just saved a life. She had anchored something that had been drifting between collapse and return. The final wolf closed its eyes. And in that moment, the distance between forest and capital disappeared completely in meaning. The Alpha King stood once more at the edge of the throne, and instead of sitting, he turned slightly toward the broken hall. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The words carried without sound breaking the air. Every lie ends where presence begins. The false authority of the capital did not respond. It simply ceased, like a structure that had realized it was no longer supported. Back in the forest, the woman suddenly felt a shift so deep it forced her to take a step back. The final wolf's body began to dissolve its remaining uncertainty, not physically but in presence. As if everything it had carried between survival and identity had finally chosen one form. The healer whispered again, but this time there was no fear in his voice. "It is not a return anymore. It is completion." The woman's eyes widened slightly as she understood what that meant. The Alpha King was no longer divided between what he was and what he had become. He was now entirely himself. And that meant the world would no longer experience him as survival or struggle, only as truth. In the capital, the Alpha King reached the edge of the palace balcony, overlooking the entire city. The wind moved around him, but did not touch him the same way it touched everything else. The world beneath him felt reorganized by presence alone. People looked up without being told. Not out of fear, out of recognition they could not explain. The Alpha King stood at the highest point of the kingdom, and for the first time since his return, he allowed silence to stretch long enough for the entire world to feel it fully. Then he spoke once more, not as command, but as final alignment. What was stolen returns to structure. What was false returns to nothing. And the kingdom, for the first time, understood what it had truly been waiting for. Not a ruler, but correction. In the forest, the woman finally lowered her hand, and the final wolf opened its eyes one last time. This time, there was no separation between what it had been and what it was. Only clarity. The wind passed through the trees gently, as if the world had finally stopped resisting its own balance. And then, from the far distance, beyond forest, beyond capital, beyond every boundary the kingdom had known, a new sound began to form. Not war, not celebration, but expansion, as if something had awakened, not just within a kingdom, but within the world itself. The woman looked toward the horizon, her heart tightening again, because she realized something that had never been spoken aloud. The Alpha King's return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything that came after it. And far away, where the throne had once stood in broken silence, the Alpha King turned slightly toward the open horizon, as if sensing something beyond the kingdom itself had already begun to respond to his existence. Something larger, something waiting, and for the first time since returning, he did not look at what he had reclaimed.
For 270 years, the Alpha King's ancient wolf had thrown every rider from its, back then a wounded report runner, arrived at the palace with proof that the king's own council had betrayed him and opened the border to the enemy. The guards destroyed her report and called her a liar, but when she touched the forbidden wolf, it bowed before her that same night. Villages burned. The king was declared a traitor, and his uncle took the throne. Now Kale has only 40 forgotten warriors, one fearless girl, and the wolf that has waited centuries to run again can, the Alpha King, reclaim his crown before his kingdom believes. The lie. The first rider did not scream when the ancient wolf threw him. He had been trained since childhood to keep his face still in front of a crowd. He was the son of a powerful commander, dressed in black ceremonial armor, carrying the pride of his family like a second blade at his side. When the wolf rose beneath him, enormous and silver white beneath the gray winter sky, the young warrior had smiled at the gathered court as though the impossible beast had already become his. Then the wolf moved. One violent twist of its spine sent the rider through the air. His body struck the frozen ground beyond the iron gate, hard enough to make the watching wolves gasp. He did not rise for several long moments. Blood darkened the snow beneath his mouth. No one rushed to help him. No one spoke. They had all seen it before. The ancient war-wolf stood alone inside the royal enclosure, its thick white fur lifting in the cold wind. Its eyes were the color of storm clouds. Old scars crossed its massive shoulders, each one a memory from wars so old that the youngest wolves knew them only as stories. It had carried Alpha Kings into battle before the current palace had been built. It had run through burning forests and over mountains where no ordinary wolf could survive. It had once been the living shadow of the royal bloodline, but for 270 years it had carried no rider. The wolf lowered its enormous head and stared at the fallen warrior without mercy. A low growl rolled from its chest. The sound moved through the courtyard like distant thunder. At the edge of the enclosure, Alpha King Kyle stood beneath the stone archway of the palace. His dark cloak hung heavy around his shoulders. Snow had settled along the crown of black hair at his temples, yet he did not move to brush it away. His face was calm, almost cold, but his hands were closed tightly behind his back. The commander beside him watched the fallen rider with a look of contained disappointment. He was an older man with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that rarely revealed fear. His name was Commander Varak, and for years he had spoken in the royal court as though his voice carried the weight of law. Another failure, Varak said quietly. Kale did not look at him. The wolf has made its choice. Varak gave a thin smile. It has made the same choice for centuries. Perhaps that is the problem. The words were soft, but they carried poison. Kale finally turned his eyes toward him. The commander lowered his head in false respect, yet the small curve of his mouth remained. Around them, nobles pretended not to hear. Guards stared ahead. Servants moved quickly through the snow with their eyes lowered. No one wanted to be seen watching the king lose another piece of his authority. The ancient wolf had become more than a beast. It had become a reminder. Every time it rejected a rider, the court whispered about a broken dynasty. Every time it threw a warrior into the snow, rival pack leaders grew bolder. Every time the king stood silent beside the enclosure, the council found another reason to question his rule. Kyle had worn the crown for 7 years. In the beginning, the kingdom had trembled when he entered a room. He had won the Northern War before he was 30. He had crushed 3 rebellion packs without burning a single village. He had carried his father from a battlefield, when every other warrior had fled, but war had made him feared. Peace had made him vulnerable. The council had learned that a king could be surrounded without being attacked. They had learned that they could hide reports, delay orders, change numbers, and whisper doubt into the ears of commanders. They had learned that they did not need to take his crown by force if they could make the kingdom believe he no longer deserved it. The fallen rider was finally dragged away by 2 guards. His armor scraped across the frozen ground. The wolf watched until he disappeared through the gates, then turned away from the crowd as though none of them were worthy of another glance. Kyle remained where he was. He remembered the first time he had seen the beast as a child. It had stood beside his father in the throne hall, taller than a horse and silent as winter. His father had placed one hand against its neck and told Kale that a true king did not command loyalty. He became the kind of leader loyalty chose to follow. At the time, Kale had believed those words were a promise. Now they felt like a warning. A bell rang from the palace tower. The sound cut through the courtyard and carried over the snow-covered roofs. It was not the bell used for meals or ceremonies. It was the bell of council summons. Varric stepped aside. The council is waiting. Kyle looked once more at the ancient wolf. The beast had moved to the far end of the enclosure, where it stood facing the distant mountains. Its breath rose in pale clouds. For one brief moment, Kale thought the wolf looked less angry than tired. Then the king turned and entered the palace. Inside, the warmth of the throne hall did nothing to ease the cold in his chest. Tall braziers burned along the walls, their flames reflected against black stone pillars carved with the names of dead rulers. At the far end of the chamber, the royal throne rose above a set of wide steps. It was made from dark wood and silver metal, shaped with wolves at the arms and a crown of sharp points above the back. Kale had once sat there with certainty. That morning, he felt every eye measuring him as he crossed the hall. The council had gathered before the throne. 7 seats formed a half-circle beneath the high windows. The men and women who occupied them wore rich robes and heavy rings. Their faces were carefully composed, but Kale knew them too well. They were not gathered to advise him. They were gathered to push him toward a decision already made in secret. Lady Seraphine sat at the center. Her hair was silver, braided tightly behind her head. She had served his father before him, and the kingdom trusted her because she spoke with calm wisdom. Kale had trusted her once too. Now, when she looked at him, he saw calculation behind her kindness. "Your Majesty," she began, "the situation at the eastern border has worsened." Kale took his place before the throne, but did not sit. "What situation?" A small silence followed. Seraphine folded her hands. "The Red Hollow Pack has gathered near the river crossing. Their scouts have been seen near our outer villages. There is fear among the border families. Fear is not a report," Kale said. Commander Varric moved forward. "We have received enough reports to know that an attack is possible." "Possible," Kale repeated. "And how many warriors have been sent to reinforce the crossing?" Varric hesitated only for a breath. "The roads are difficult because of the storm. Supplies have been delayed." Kyle looked around the council circle. Delayed by whom? No one answered. The king stepped closer. The room seemed to tighten around him. For a moment, the old fear returned to the faces of the nobles. They remembered the warrior king. They remembered the man who had ended wars with a single command. But Lady Seraphine did not look away. "Your Majesty," she said, "this is exactly why we have called the council. The kingdom needs stability. The people are worried. The commanders are uncertain. We cannot allow a border conflict to become a war." Kale stared at her. "What do you suggest?" A document was brought forward by a servant. It was sealed in red wax. Seraphine spoke gently, as though offering him relief. A temporary emergency agreement. The Council will oversee military movement and border decisions until the threat passes. This will prevent panic and show the neighboring Pax that our kingdom is united. Kyle looked down at the document. He did not need to read every word to understand what it meant. It would take the army from his hands. It would place the Council between him and every command. It would make him king only in name. The silence in the hall became unbearable. Kyle lifted his eyes. You want me to surrender authority while an enemy gathers at the border. We want to protect the kingdom, Varric said. The king stepped closer to him. And who protects the kingdom from you? Varric's expression did not change, but the color left his face. Lady Seraphine rose slowly from her chair. No one is your enemy here. That was when Kale understood how deeply the rot had spread. They no longer feared saying it. They believed he had become too isolated to fight them. Far beyond the palace walls, on the eastern road, a young woman ran through the snow, with blood on her sleeve and a sealed report pressed against her. Her name was Elira. She had not slept in 2 days. The wind cut against her face as she ran between frozen trees. Her boots had split near the heel. Her lungs burned. Every breath felt like ice dragged through her ribs, but she did not slow down. Behind her, the border villages were already falling silent. She had seen the warning fires go out one by one. She had seen royal soldiers standing aside while strangers crossed through the river pass. At first, she had thought the soldiers were afraid. Then she had found the orders. They had been hidden inside the command tent beneath maps and supply lists. They carried the seal of the Royal Council. The orders demanded that the eastern defenses remain open. They commanded the soldiers to delay all messages to the king. They promised gold and new ranks to anyone who followed without question. Elira had read the words 3 times because her mind refused to believe them. The enemy was not simply coming from outside. Someone inside the palace had opened the door, had stolen the report and run before the commander could return. A guard had chased her through the camp. Another had fired an arrow that cut across her arm. She had fallen into the snow, hidden beneath the roots of an old pine tree, and waited until night covered the road. Then she ran. Elira was not a noble. She had no family name that opened doors. Her mother had been a healer in a small border village. Her father had died in a winter hunt when she was still young. She had become a report runner because she could move quickly through forests and because she had learned that messages often mattered more than weapons. But she had never carried a message like this. This was not a report. It was a death sentence for anyone who tried to deliver it. When the palace gates finally appeared through the falling snow, Elira almost collapsed from relief. Tall black walls rose above her, guarded by towers and iron banners. The royal wolf symbol hung above the entrance, half hidden beneath frost. She pushed herself harder. 2 guards stepped forward as she approached. "Stop there," one of them ordered. Elira stumbled to a halt. "I need to see the Alpha King." The guards looked at her torn cloak, blood-stained sleeve, and muddy boots. One of them laughed. "Everyone needs to see the Alpha King. It is urgent," Elira said. "I have a report from the eastern border." The second guard held out his hand. "Give it to us." "No," she said quickly. "It must go directly to the king." The first guard's smile vanished. "You are giving orders now." Elira tightened her grip around the sealed paper. "Please, people are in danger. The council has sent false orders. The border defenses are open." The guards exchanged a glance. That glance was enough. Fear moved through Elira like cold water. The first guard stepped close. "You should be careful with accusations like that. I saw the orders," she whispered. His hand struck her across the face. The report slipped from her fingers and landed in the snow. For a moment, Elira could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears. She tasted blood. Her knees shook, but she reached for the paper. The second guard stepped on it first. "You came all this way to deliver a story," he said. "You should have stayed at the border." Elira looked up at them. "The enemy is coming." The first guard bent down, lifted the report, and broke the seal. Her heart stopped. He read the first lines. His expression changed. The amusement disappeared from his face. Then he tore the report in half. Elira stared at the pieces fluttering down into the snow. He tore it again, and again. The paper vanished beneath his boots. No, she breathed. The guard leaned toward her. Go home, runner. If you have one left. Something inside her broke then. Not because they had hit her. Not because they had laughed. It broke because the people at the border were waiting for help that would never come. Children were hiding in cellars. Families were packing what little they could carry. Soldiers who still believed in the king were being ordered to stand down. And here, at the gates of the palace, the truth had been destroyed before it could even be heard. Elira turned her head toward the courtyard. Beyond the gate, she could see the royal enclosure. The ancient wolf stood inside it alone. Even from a distance, it looked impossible. White fur, massive shoulders, a stillness that did not belong to an ordinary creature. The guards noticed where she was looking and laughed again. Do not even think about it, one of them said. That beast has killed stronger wolves than you. Elira did not answer. She did not know why she began. Walking. Perhaps there was no reason left to be afraid. Perhaps she had already lost everything that fear could protect. The guards called after her. One reached for her arm, but she pulled away with a strength she did not know she possessed. She crossed the courtyard slowly at first, then faster as voices rose behind her. The ancient wolf lifted its head. Every person nearby froze. Elira stepped toward the iron gate. The wolf watched her. Its eyes were pale and deep, filled with something older than anger. She stopped just beyond the bars. Her hands were shaking. Her face still burned from the blow. Snow gathered in her hair. Blood from her arm ran down her wrist and fell onto the frozen ground. I do not have proof anymore, she whispered. But they are coming. The wolf did not move. Elira swallowed hard. The king does not know. A growl began deep inside the beast. The guards rushed toward her. Move away from the enclosure, one shouted. But the wolf stepped forward. Its paws crushed the snow beneath them. Its body rose higher than Elira had imagined. The iron gate trembled as it pressed its head against the bars. Everyone in the courtyard stopped, breathing. The ancient wolf had not allowed a hand near it for centuries. Elira could see the scars along its muzzle. She could see the frost caught in its fur. She could see pain in its eyes that looked strangely familiar. She raised one trembling hand. The guards shouted, again. Then her fingers touched the wolf's forehead. Beast went still. The entire palace seemed to fall. Silent around them, Elira felt warmth beneath her palm. Not the warmth of fur. Something deeper. Something alive and ancient. Moving like a heartbeat beneath the skin. The wolf lowered its head. Slowly, deliberately, it bowed before her. A scream rose from somewhere. Behind the crowd, the guard stumbled. Backward. From the throne hall windows above, Alpha King Kyle looked down into the courtyard. He saw the girl in torn clothes standing before the ancient wolf. He saw the wolf kneeling, and for the first time in 7 years, fear entered the heart of the Alpha King, because the wolf had not bowed to him, it had bowed to her. The ancient wolf rose so suddenly that the iron gate screamed against its hinges. Snow burst beneath its paws as it turned toward the palace, its enormous body moving with a force that made the guards stumble back in terror. Elira stood frozen beside the enclosure, her hand still lifted in the air where she had touched the wolf's forehead. The warmth beneath her palm had vanished, but the feeling remained inside her. It was not a simple touch. It was as if something old had looked into her heart and found a truth she had not known how to speak. Above the courtyard, the high windows of the throne hall darkened with moving shadows. Nobles pressed close to the glass. Guards gathered along the stone walls. The sound of alarm bells began to rise from the towers, sharp and frantic against the winter wind. For generations, the palace had feared the ancient wolf more than any enemy beyond the borders. It had been locked away not because it was weak, but because no one had been able to understand what it wanted. Now it was no longer standing alone, it was standing beside her. The guard who had torn Alira's report rushed forward with his hand on the hilt of his sword. His face had lost all color. He looked from the wolf to Alira and then toward the palace doors, as though searching for someone else to blame for what was happening. "Step away from it," he ordered. Alira did not move. The wolf lowered its head beside her shoulder. Its breath washed over her cloak, warm and heavy. The guard raised his sword, but the wolf's eyes opened fully. A deep growl rolled across the courtyard. It was not loud at first. It was worse than loud. It was a warning that seemed to enter the bones of everyone who heard it. The guard stopped. His sword trembled in his hand. The second guard backed away. "This is forbidden," he whispered. "No one can approach it." Alira looked at the torn pieces of the report scattered beneath the snow. The truth had been destroyed in front of her. The border was still open. The enemy was still coming. Every moment she stood in this courtyard was another moment in which people might die. She turned toward the palace doors. "I have to see the king," she said. The first guard stared at her as though she had become something impossible. "You cannot enter the throne hall." The wolf stepped forward. The guard's answer disappeared. The ancient beast moved past Alira and pressed its body against the iron gate. Metal groaned. The guards ran back as the gate bent beneath its weight. One more push sent the old lock snapping apart. The enclosure doors flew open and struck the stone wall with a sound that echoed across the palace grounds. For the first time in 270 years, the ancient wolf walked free. No one tried to stop it. Alira followed because she understood there was no other choice. The wolf moved through the courtyard with slow, terrible certainty. Its white fur shone against the falling snow, making it seem less like an animal and more like a spirit from the old stories. The guards parted before it. Servants dropped to their knees. Warriors who had faced battlefields without fear stepped aside with their heads lowered. Alira walked close to its side, her legs shaking from exhaustion. She could feel blood running down her arm beneath her torn sleeve. Her cheek still burned where the guard had struck her. Yet each step toward the throne hall made her feel stronger, not because she had forgotten her fear, but because fear no longer mattered more than the lives waiting at the border. The great doors of the palace stood ahead of them. They opened before the wolf reached them. Inside the throne hall, the warmth from the braziers met the cold air around Alira like a wall. The flames along the stone pillars bent and flickered as the ancient wolf entered. The room that had been full of voices only moments before fell silent. Alpha King Kale stood at the base of the throne steps. He had not moved from the window. His dark eyes were fixed on the wolf, but Alira could see something beneath the calmness in his face. It was not simple shock. It was the expression of a man who had spent years believing something was lost forever, only to see it return in a form he could not understand. The council members stood behind him. Lady Seraphine had one hand pressed against the edge of her chair. Commander Varric had gone still, his eyes narrowing as he watched Alira. The other council members looked frightened, but Varric looked angry. Alira knew that look. It was the look of someone who had just lost control of a plan. The ancient wolf walked forward until it stood between Alira and the council. Its head rose high. Its shoulders blocked the light from the braziers. It did not bow to the king. It did not look at the throne. It looked only at the people gathered around the throne hall. Then it turned its head toward Alira. Kale finally spoke. "Who are you?" His voice was deep and controlled. It did not rise, yet it carried through the entire hall. Alira forced herself to stand straight. "My name is Alira. I came from the eastern border." The king's gaze moved to the blood on her sleeve. "What happened there?" She opened her mouth, but Commander Varric stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this girl has caused a disturbance at the gates. She has no authority to enter this hall. The wolf has been provoked. We should remove her before this becomes dangerous." The ancient wolf turned its head toward him. Varric stopped. The wolf did not growl. It did not need to. Its eyes rested on him with such cold certainty that the commander's hand slowly fell away from his sword. Elira looked at the king. "I brought a report. There are enemy wolves gathering near the river crossing." The border defenses were left open. A murmur moved through the hall. Lady Seraphine's face remained calm. "The council has already informed His Majesty that there is unrest near the border." Elira shook her head. "This is not unrest. The soldiers were given orders not to defend the crossing. They were told to delay messages to the palace." The room became still again. Kale's eyes sharpened. "Whose orders?" Elira looked toward the council seats. Her throat tightened. She remembered the seal pressed into the wax. She remembered the red mark on the command paper. She remembered the guard's face when he read the first lines of her report, before tearing it apart. The same seal was carved into the silver ring on Commander Varric's hand. Elira pointed toward him. His. The word fell into the throne hall like a blade. "Commander." Varric's expression did not break, but the air around him seemed to change. He looked at Elira with a coldness that made her stomach turn. "This is madness," he said. "A wounded runner arrives without proof and accuses the commander of the royal army." "I saw the orders," Elira said. "They were hidden in the eastern command tent. They told the soldiers to leave the crossing open." Varric's voice hardened. "And where are these orders now?" Elira looked down. The silence that followed was cruel. "The guards tore them apart," she said quietly. At the gates, a few council members exchanged looks. One of them lowered his eyes. Lady Seraphine's face softened with false sympathy. "A terrible accusation without evidence," she said. "It is unfortunate that fear can make people believe what they wish to believe." Elira felt the humiliation return, stronger than before. She had run through snow and blood. She had watched villages prepare for death. She had reached the palace only to have the truth destroyed by the people who were supposed to protect it. Now the council was turning her warning into a lie. Kale did not speak. That silence hurt more than the guard's hand. The ancient wolf moved closer to Elira. Its fur brushed against her shoulder. The warmth of its body steadied her. She looked at the king again and saw the conflict behind his eyes. He did not trust the council completely. She could feel that. But he did not know her either. She was a stranger standing in his hall with no proof and an impossible wolf at her side. She understood why he hesitated. But the border did not have time for hesitation. "The enemy will cross before dawn," she said. "If no one rides east now, they will reach the villages." Varric gave a humorless smile. "The king cannot move an army because of the fear of one report runner." The wolf suddenly stepped forward. Its massive paw struck the stone floor. The sound cracked through the hall. Every brazier flame bent low. The nobles flinched. The council members rose from their seats. The wolf stood before Varric, close enough that its breath moved the commander's cloak. Varric did not retreat, but his eyes did. For the first time, Elira saw fear in him. Kyle lifted one hand. The wolf stopped. It did not turn to him. It did not lower its head. Yet it obeyed. The entire hall noticed. The king's hand remained raised for a moment, and Elira saw the smallest change in his expression. He had expected the wolf to ignore him. Instead, it had listened. Not fully, not like a loyal mount, but enough. Kale lowered his hand and faced the council. "No one will leave this palace until I decide what has happened," he said. Lady Seraphine stepped forward. "Your Majesty, closing the palace over an unproven accusation will create panic." Kale turned toward her. "Panic is what happens when a kingdom discovers its leaders have hidden danger from its king." Her eyes narrowed slightly. The old authority entered his voice then. It was not loud. It was not wild. It was something colder and more dangerous. The throne hall had seen Kale command armies before. It had seen him make decisions that changed the fate of packs. But for years, the council had learned to soften him with delays, agreements, and careful words. Now the king's patience was gone. He looked toward the guards at the doors. Bring the gate guards here. The 2 guards who had destroyed Alira's report were dragged into the hall minutes later. Snow still clung to their boots. Their faces had become pale with terror when they saw Alira standing beside the ancient wolf. Kale stood before them. Did this runner bring a report to the gates? The first guard swallowed. She brought papers, Your Majesty. Did you read them? The guard looked toward Varric. Kyle noticed. Answer me. The guard's knees weakened. I read part of it, and then the guard stared at the floor. We were told to destroy it. The hall exploded into whispers. Alira's heart pounded. Kale's face remained still, but his eyes darkened. Told by whom? The guard did not answer. Commander Varric stepped forward. This is absurd. The guards are frightened. They will say anything to escape punishment. The ancient wolf bared its teeth. The guard broke. Captain Roran, he said. Captain Roran told us that no report from the eastern border was to reach the king. Without council approval, Kale turned slowly toward Varric. Captain Roran served. Under Varric's command, the commander's jaw tightened. Where is Captain Roran? Kale asked. No one answered. A young guard near the door stepped forward with shaking hands. He left the palace before the storm grew worse, Your Majesty. He rode east with 6 men. Varric's face hardened. He was sent to inspect the border. Kale looked at him for a long moment. Then why did he leave before the council told me there was a border threat? Varric did not reply. The king walked toward the throne, but he did not sit. He stood beside it and looked down at the council as though he were seeing them clearly for the first time. For years, he had allowed them to speak for the kingdom. He had allowed them to place papers before him and call them wisdom. He had accepted their delays because he believed stability mattered more than pride. But now a girl stood bleeding in his throne hall because someone had decided her truth was too dangerous. To reach him, Kale looked at Alira. You said you saw the orders. Yes, she replied. Can you remember them? Every word. The king studied her face. She looked exhausted. Her cloak was torn. Her hands were trembling. Yet she did not lower her eyes. He had seen warriors with polished armor break beneath less pressure than this. He turned to the guards. Take her to the healer, Alira shook her head. I cannot rest. The border needs help. You will receive treatment, Kyle said. Then you will tell me everything you remember. The command in his voice was firm, but it did not feel cruel. For the first time since she reached the palace, Alira felt the weight inside her chest loosen slightly. Not because she trusted the court, not yet, but because the king had heard her. The ancient wolf followed when the guards moved toward her. Kale watched it. The wolf walked beside Alira through the hall, close enough that no one dared approach her. The creature had entered the palace as a storm. Now it moved with quiet purpose, guarding a low-ranking report runner as though she carried something more precious than the crown itself. When Alira reached the doors, she looked back. The king was still standing beside his throne. The council surrounded him, but he looked alone. Their eyes met for only a moment. Then the doors closed between them. The healer's chamber was small compared to the throne hall. Its walls were lined with dried herbs, polished jars, and shelves filled with old books. A fire burned in the corner, filling the room with the scent of pine and bitter roots. Alira sat on a wooden bench while an elderly healer cleaned the wound on her arm. The pain made her fingers tighten against the edge of the seat, but she did not make a sound. The ancient wolf lay across the doorway. No guard entered. No servant crossed the room without keeping a careful distance. The healer glanced toward the beast and then back at Alira. I have treated kings, soldiers, and children, she said quietly. I have never treated anyone protected by that wolf. Alira watched the fire. I do not know why it chose me. Perhaps it knows something you do not. Alira did not answer. She thought of the wolf's eyes. There had been grief inside them. A grief that felt old enough to belong to the palace itself. She wondered whether it had been lonely in that enclosure. She wondered whether it had waited through centuries for someone to say the words she had said without knowing why they mattered. "The king does not trust easily," the healer said. "He should not," Alira replied. The healer tied a clean cloth around her arm. "No. But he has not looked at anyone the way he looked at you today." Alira felt heat rise to her face, though she did not understand why. She had not come to be noticed. She had come to save people. Outside the chamber, footsteps moved along the corridor. The wolf lifted its head. Low growl vibrated through the floor. The healer froze. Alira turned toward the door. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice came from the other side. "Open this door. It nigh?" Was Commander Varek. The wolf rose. The door shook. Beneath a heavy strike, Alira stood from the bench. The healer reached for her arm. "Do not." Another strike hit the door. The wolf moved in front of Alira, its white fur rising along its spine. Its eyes had changed. The calm storm gray had become something darker. Then the corridor went silent. Shadow passed beneath the door. A folded piece of paper slid slowly across the floor. The wolf did not move until Alira picked it up. Her hands shook as she opened. There were only 6 words written in dark ink. "The border villages are already burning." Alira stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then, beneath the words, she saw a symbol pressed into the paper. It was the same seal that had been carved into Commander Varek's ring. The message was still warm when Alira placed it in Alpha King Kale's hand. For several long seconds, he did not read it. He stood in the narrow healer's corridor with the ancient wolf beside him and the torn edge of the paper caught between his fingers. The firelight from the chamber behind them touched the hard line of his face, but it could not soften the darkness gathering in his eyes. Outside the palace windows, the storm had swallowed the night. Snow moved across the glass in white waves, hiding the roads that led east. Then Kale looked down. "The border villages are already burning." The words were few, but they changed the air around him. Alira watched his expression carefully. She expected anger. She expected disbelief. Instead, the king became very still. His silence was worse than rage because it carried the weight of something being forced awake inside him. The ancient wolf lowered its head near the paper. Its pale eyes fixed on the seal pressed beneath the message. The same seal that had marked the orders at the border. The same seal carved into Commander Varek's ring. Kale closed his hand around the note. "No one in this corridor speaks of this message," he said. The healer looked frightened. "Your Majesty, if the villages are burning, the council must be told. The council will be told what I decide they need to know." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with absolute force. Alira stepped forward. "We have to send riders now." Kel turned toward her. "How many villages?" she swallowed. "I saw smoke from 3. There may be more beyond the river." The Red Hollow wolves were gathering in the trees. They were waiting for the crossing to be left open. How many I do not know. Enough to destroy anyone who stands alone. The king looked at the ancient wolf. The creature had not moved away from Alira since entering the palace. It stood close to her as if her heartbeat had become part of its duty. Kale had spent years trying to understand why the wolf had rejected every rider. Now he watched it protect a girl who had arrived with nothing but blood on her sleeve and a warning no one wanted to hear. The old stories said the royal wolf did not choose strength. It chose truth. Kale had dismissed those stories as the comfort of dead kings. Tonight, he was no longer certain. He gave one command to the guards waiting at the end of the corridor. "Bring Captain Darius to the war room." Quietly. The guards bowed and disappeared. Alira stared at him. "You trust him. I trust him enough to test him." The answer surprised her. It was not the answer of a man reaching for hope. It was the answer of someone who had learned that trust could be used as a weapon. Kale walked toward the war room without waiting for anyone to follow. Alira moved behind him and the ancient wolf came beside her. The palace corridors felt different now. Every shadow seemed to hold a listener. Every closed door felt like a secret. Servants who passed them lowered their heads too quickly. Guards stood at their posts with stiff shoulders and careful eyes. Elira had entered the palace believing it was a place of safety. Now she understood that danger could wear polished armor and stand beneath royal banners. The war room was built beneath the western tower. It had no windows, only thick stone walls and a long table carved with maps of the kingdom. Small metal figures marked the borders. Blue stones marked rivers. Black stones marked enemy territory. The eastern crossing was represented by a narrow line of silver beneath a carved mountain ridge. Kyle stood over the map as Captain Darius entered. Darius was younger than Commander Varric, though his face carried the tiredness of a man who had spent too many winters guarding places no one remembered. He wore simple battle armor without gold decoration. A scar ran from his jaw to the edge of his collar. When he saw Elira and the ancient wolf, he stopped at the doorway. "Your Majesty," he said. "Close the door," Kale replied. Darius did. Kale placed the message on the table. The captain read it once. Then he read it again. "Who delivered this?" Elira stepped forward. "I came from the eastern border." Darius looked at her wound. His eyes shifted to the wolf. He did not ask why the beast was there. He seemed to understand that some questions had to wait. Kale pointed to the river crossing. "Tell me the current strength of our Eastern Guard." Darius hesitated. "Tell me the truth," Kale said. 200 soldiers were assigned to the crossing. Only 80 remain. Why? Darius looked at the map. The other units were moved south 3 days ago by council order. They said there was unrest near the trade road. Kale's jaw tightened. "And you did not report this to me. I sent 2 reports. I received none." Darius looked up. Then someone stopped them. The room fell silent. Kale leaned over the table. "If Red Hollow crosses tonight, where will they go?" Darius moved a finger across the map. "First through the river villages, then north toward the grain stores. If they take those, the outer packs will panic. They will believe the palace cannot protect them. That is the plan," Kyle said. Elira felt cold despite the fire burning in the corner. "They do not only want the villages." "No," Kale said. "They want the kingdom to watch me fail." The words hung between them. For years, Kale had fought enemies who showed their teeth from across a battlefield. This enemy had sat near his throne. It had spoken to him in respectful voices. It had offered him advice while quietly cutting the strength from his hands. The betrayal was not only military, it was personal. Darius looked at the king. "What are your orders?" Kale did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the map. Elira watched him and saw the pressure pressing against him from every side. If he moved the army openly, the council would know. If the council knew, Captain Roran and the men at the border would be warned. If he waited, more villages would burn. The ancient wolf stepped closer to the table, its head lowered, over the eastern map. Then it placed one heavy paw directly on the river crossing. The metal pieces scattered across the table. Elira stared at the wolf. Kyle did too. The creature looked at him with storm-gray eyes. For a moment, the king remembered his father's words. A true king does not command loyalty. He becomes the kind of leader loyalty chooses to follow. Kale straightened. "We do not send the army," he said. Elira's breath caught. "But the villages need help." "They do," Kale said. "And they will have it. But if I send banners and soldiers through the main roads, Varric will know before they reach the first hill." Darius waited. Kyle looked toward him. "Gather the wolves who were dismissed from service last winter. The ones Varric called too old, too injured, too difficult to control." Darius's eyes widened. "There are barely 40 of them. 40 wolves who have nothing left to lose are worth more than 200 soldiers who obey the wrong master." Kale pointed toward the western edge of the map. "Send them through the old hunting trails. No banners. No armor that carries the royal mark." They leave in silence. Darius nodded slowly. "And the palace guard. Keep them where they are." Let the council believe I am still deciding whether the border is worth defending. Elira looked at him. You are going to let them think you are weak. Cale's eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw something sharp beneath his calmness. I am going to let them believe what they already want to believe. The words sent a quiet chill through her. Darius bowed and left to gather the forgotten warriors. Cale remained at the table. The ancient wolf moved around Elira and rested its head near her shoulder. She placed her hand against its fur without thinking. The wolf's breathing was slow and deep. It made her feel less alone in the cold room. You should rest, Kyle said. Elira shook her head. I know the eastern trails. I can lead them. You can barely stand. I ran for 2 days. I can still ride. Cale's gaze moved to the blood on her sleeve. You are not a weapon. No, she said. I am a runner, and I know where the enemy scouts hide. The king looked at her for a long moment. There was no pity in his face. She was grateful for that. Pity would have made her feel small. Instead, he looked as though he was measuring her courage against the danger ahead. Finally, he nodded. You will lead Darius to the river road. Elira felt relief move through her, followed quickly by fear. She had wanted to return. She had also hoped she would not have to see the burning villages again. But there was no place left for fear now. The ancient wolf lifted its head. Kyle looked toward it. No, he said quietly. The wolf did not move. You cannot leave the palace. The beast stared at him. Cale's expression hardened. The council will notice. The wolf stepped closer to Elira. The answer was clear. Elira looked between them. It wants to come. Kyle gave a short breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. It has not listened to anyone for 270 years. The wolf turned and walked toward the door. Elira followed. Cale watched them go. For a heartbeat, he remained alone beside the map. Then he reached for the black cloak hanging near the wall and pulled it around his shoulders. Darius returned before midnight with 40 warriors gathered in the lower courtyard. They were not the polished soldiers who guarded the palace halls. Some had gray in their hair. Some carried old wounds in the way they stood. One had a damaged eye. Another walked with a slight limp. Their armor was worn and plain, but when Cale entered the courtyard, every one of them straightened. They had been forgotten by the council. They had not forgotten their king. The storm had eased into a hard, bitter wind. Torches burned low beneath the stone arches. Elira stood beside the ancient wolf while Darius checked the last straps on his sword. Cale walked toward the group without a crown. That small detail changed everything. Did not look like a ruler walking out to be admired. He looked like a warrior preparing to enter a place where no one would protect him. The old soldiers watched him in silence. Kyle stopped before them. The eastern border has been left open, he said. The people there were abandoned by those who swore to defend them. Tonight we ride not for glory and not for the council. We ride because the kingdom belongs to the wolves who bleed for it. No one cheered. The words did not need cheering. The warriors lowered their heads. Then they mounted their horses and moved through the hidden gate beneath the western wall. Elira climbed onto a small gray mare. The ancient wolf walked beside her, larger than any horse in the courtyard. When the gate opened, cold darkness stretched before them. The road beyond the palace disappeared into snow and black trees. Cale rode at the front. As they passed beneath the gate, Elira looked back once, high above the palace. A single window glowed in the council wing. A figure stood behind it. She could not see the face clearly, but she knew someone had watched them leave. The journey east was silent at first. Snow covered the forest floor, swallowing the sound of hooves. The warriors moved in a narrow line between frozen pines. Cale rode without speaking, his cloak snapping behind him in the wind. The ancient wolf stayed close to Elira's mare, its pale body appearing and disappearing through the trees. Hours passed. The deeper they traveled, the more Elira recognized the signs of fear. A broken cart lay abandoned near the road. A child's wooden toy rested in the snow beside it. Farther ahead, smoke drifted through the trees. It was thin at first, almost hidden by the storm. Then the smell reached them. Burned wood, burned grain, burned homes. Darius raised one hand and the group stopped. Elira climbed down from her mare. Her legs shook when they touched the ground. The ancient wolf moved ahead, silent as a shadow. Kale dismounted and came beside her. The first village appeared beyond the trees. It was empty. Doors hung open. Roofs had collapsed beneath fire and snow. The central well was surrounded by broken barrels and scattered blankets. No bodies lay in the streets, which frightened Elira more than if they had. It meant the villagers had either escaped or been taken. She walked toward a small house at the edge of the village. The door was half burned. Inside, she found a cooking pot overturned near the ashes of a cold fire. A scarf lay on the floor beside a trail of muddy footprints. "They were here," she whispered. Kale entered behind her. He looked at the footprints. "Too many for one family." "Taken east," Darius said from the doorway. Elira turned sharply. Why would Red Hollow take them? Kale's face became unreadable. "They need witnesses." "For what?" He did not answer. Outside, the ancient wolf began to growl. Every warrior reached for a weapon. The sound came from the forest beyond the village. It was not the growl of one wolf. It was many voices moving together through the darkness. Red Hollow scouts appeared between the trees, their eyes reflecting torchlight. They did not attack. They stood at a distance, watching. Then one of them stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark leather armor marked with red fur along the collar. His face held the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. He looked directly at Kyle. "The king finally came," he said. Kyle did not move. "Where are the villagers?" The scout smiled. "Safe enough for now." Elira stepped forward, but Kale lifted a hand to stop her. The scout's eyes shifted to the ancient wolf. The smile faded. "So the old beast runs again," he said. "That changes more than I expected." Kale's voice was low. "Answer me." The scout reached inside his cloak and removed a strip of dark cloth. It was tied around a small piece of wood. He threw it into the snow. Elira picked it up. It was part of a royal command marker. The mark carved into it belonged to Captain Roran. The scout watched her face. "Your commander asked us to leave the first village standing. He said the king would come himself if the runner survived." Kale's hand tightened around his sword. The scout took a step back into the trees. "You are late. Alpha King. By dawn, the council will tell your people that you abandoned the East, and when they believe it, they will no longer need your crown." The forest swallowed him. For several seconds, no one moved. Then a scream rose from somewhere beyond the trees. It was distant. It was terrified, and Elira knew that. Voice? It belonged to a child from the border. Village where she had grown up. The ancient wolf launched forward into the darkness. Elira ran after it. Kale shouted her name, but the forest had already taken her. Ahead, through the trees, torchlight flashed against steel, and somewhere in the burning dark, the enemy was waiting for her. The scream ended before Elira reached the trees. That silence was worse than the sound itself. She ran through, the snow with branches striking against her face, and frozen roots catching at her boots. The ancient wolf moved ahead of her like a white shadow, tearing through the darkness with impossible speed. Behind her, Kyle's voice called her name once, then again, but the forest swallowed every sound beneath the rising wind. Torchlight flashed between the pines. Elira saw a small shape on the ground. Her heart stopped. It was a child wrapped in a dark blanket, lying beside an overturned cart. For one terrible moment, Elira believed she had arrived too late. Then the child moved. A thin hand lifted from the snow. Elira dropped to her knees beside him. His name was Terran. He was 8 years old and lived near the river village where Elira had grown up. His face was streaked with soot. His eyes were wide with terror. A rope had been tied around his wrists, but one side had loosened as he fell from the cart. Elira pulled him into her arms. "Taryn, where is your mother?" The boy tried to speak, but his teeth were shaking too hard. He pointed toward the dark road ahead. "They took them," he whispered. "They took everyone." The ancient wolf stood near the road with its head lowered. Its ears were raised toward the distant forest. It was listening. Elira looked at the tracks in the snow. There were many: boots, wagon wheels, drag marks, wolves moving quickly east. Kael arrived seconds later with Darius and the forgotten warriors behind him. His breath rose in pale clouds. His dark cloak was dusted with snow. He looked at Taryn, then at the road, then at Elira. "The child is alive," Elira said. "The others were taken." Kael crouched beside the boy. His voice changed when he spoke to him. It was still firm, but softer than Elira expected. "Did you see who took them?" Taryn nodded slowly. "Wolves in red, and men from the palace." Darius went still. Kael's face did not change, but his eyes became colder. "What men?" The boy pressed closer to Elira. "They wore the king's mark. But they said the king had left us." The words struck harder than any weapon. Kael looked toward the burning village behind them. Smoke moved through the trees like a dark river. Somewhere far away, bells were ringing, though no one could see the village tower through the storm. The enemy had not only attacked, they had dressed themselves in the king's colors. They had turned fear into a lie. Kyle rose slowly. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "They want the people to believe I abandoned them," he said. Darius looked toward the tracks. "Then we take the prisoners back before dawn." Kyle studied the road. "No, we do not chase them blindly." Elira stared at him. "They are taking families into the forest, and that is exactly what they expect us to do." His words made her anger flare. "So we wait." Kael turned toward her. "No, we hunt them with our eyes open." The ancient wolf moved closer to Elira and lowered, its head beside Taryn. The child froze at first, then reached out with shaking fingers. When his hand touched the wolf's fur, he began to cry without sound.
Elira watched the wolf remain still for him. For the first time, she understood that the beast did not protect only her. It protected those who had no one else. Kael looked at Darius. "Take the child and 2 warriors back to the village. Search every house. Find anyone hiding. Light no signal fires." Darius hesitated. "And you?" Kael looked toward the eastern road. "I am going after the prisoners." "With how many?" Kael turned to the old warriors. 20 will come with me. The rest will hold the village and wait for the signal." Darius's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty, this could be a trap." Kael's eyes moved to the ancient wolf. "It already is." The wolf stared back at him. For a moment, the king and the beast stood facing one another in the falling snow. Elira could feel the tension between them. Kael did not command the wolf. He did not reach for it. He simply looked at it as though he understood that both of them had been betrayed by the same kingdom. Then the wolf turned east. Kael nodded once. The hunt began. They moved through the forest without torches. Moonlight pressed weakly through the storm clouds, turning the snow blue and silver beneath their feet. Elira rode behind Kael on a narrow trail that curved around the frozen river. The ancient wolf ran ahead, disappearing into the trees and returning every few minutes, with its nose close to the ground. The old warriors followed in silence. They were not young, but they knew how to move without being seen. Their armor had been wrapped in dark cloth. Their weapons were kept close. No one spoke unless necessary. Elira watched Kael from behind. He had changed since the palace. At first, she had seen a king surrounded by people who made him hesitate. Now she saw a man who had stopped waiting for permission. His shoulders were straight. His attention never left the road. He did not look back toward the palace or speak of the council. He had chosen his side. The forgotten warriors had chosen theirs. After an hour, the ancient wolf stopped beside a steep ravine. It stood perfectly still, staring down into the darkness below. Kale dismounted. Elira followed, though her legs ached from the cold and exhaustion. She moved to the edge and looked down. A camp burned beneath the cliffs. There were tents made from dark hides. Wagons stood near the frozen river. Prisoners were gathered inside a wooden pen at the center. Elira could see women holding children close. Men sat with their hands tied behind their backs. Red hollow wolves moved around the camp with weapons in their hands. And among them were soldiers wearing royal armor. Elira felt sick. There, near the largest tent, stood Captain Roran. Even from the ravine, she recognized his broad shoulders and the silver crest on his chest. He was speaking with a tall figure wrapped in a black fur cloak. The figure's face was hidden, but the warriors around him lowered their heads whenever he moved. Kale crouched beside Elira. "Roran is here," she whispered. "I see him. There are too many." Kale studied the camp. "We are not here to fight everyone." Elira looked at the prisoners. "Then why are we here?" "To break the lie." She did not understand. Kale pointed toward the royal soldiers. "They want the villages to believe the king abandoned them. They want the prisoners to spread that fear when they are released. If we attack like raiders, they will use the chaos against us." "Darius is not here," Elira said.
"No."
"But he will be when we need him." Kale's voice was quiet and certain. Elira looked at him. "You planned this." "I planned for betrayal. I did not know its shape." Below them, Captain Roran stepped into the prisoner pen. He dragged an old man forward and held a blade near his throat. Elira recognized the old man as the miller from her village. He had given her bread when her mother was sick. He had once told her that courage was not the absence of fear. It was deciding that something mattered more. The miller looked broken now. Captain Roran raised his voice so the prisoners could hear. "By sunrise, the palace will announce that the eastern villages were lost because the king refused to send help. You will remember that when you return home." The prisoners remained silent. Roran struck the old man across the face. Elira moved forward, but Kale caught her wrist. "Not yet." Her eyes filled with anger. "He will kill him. If we move now, they kill all of them." The words were hard, but Kale's hand tightened only once around her wrist before he released it. He was not unmoved. Elira could see it in his face. He was holding back the same rage that burned inside her. That was the difference between them. She wanted to run into the camp and save one person. He was trying to save everyone. The ancient wolf suddenly lifted its head. A low warning came from its throat. Kale looked toward the northern edge of the camp. More riders were arriving. They wore dark cloaks and carried no banners. Yet the way the red hollow wolves moved aside for them showed that they were important. One rider dismounted near the largest tent. He pulled back his hood. Elira's breath caught. It was not Commander Varek. It was Lord Malrek, one of the council members who had sat silently in the throne hall. He was known for controlling the grain stores and trade roads. He had always spoken gently. He had always smiled when he greeted the king. Now he walked through the enemy camp as though he belonged there. Kale watched him without moving. "Another council member," Elira whispered. Kale's eyes stayed on Malrek. "Not another. One of the same hand." Malrek spoke to the cloaked figure near the tent. Their words could not be heard from the ravine, but Roran moved closer. Then Malrek removed a sealed document from inside his cloak. The tall, cloaked figure took it. A gust of wind lifted the hood from his head. Kale went still. The man beneath the hood had dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His face was sharp and familiar. A scar crossed his brow. He was older than Kale, but he carried himself with the same royal posture. Elira looked at the king. She saw the color leave his face. "Who is that?" she whispered. Kale did not answer at first. The ancient wolf growled so deeply that the ravine stones trembled. Then Kale spoke. "My uncle." Elira stared at the man below. The name had been spoken in stories with fear. Prince Darian, the brother of Kale's father, had vanished before Kale was born. The palace claimed he had died in the Northern War. Some said he had betrayed the royal bloodline. Others said he had been killed because he wanted the throne. But he was alive. And he was standing with the enemy. Darian lifted the document in front of the campfire. Even from above, Alira could see the royal seal pressed into the wax. Cale's voice was barely more than a breath. They are preparing a claim. A claim to what? The throne. The truth of the conspiracy opened before them like a wound. The border attack was not only meant to weaken Cale. It was meant to destroy the belief that he could rule. Once the kingdom believed he had failed, the council would present Darian as the stronger bloodline. A ruler from the old royal house. A man ready to take control after Cale's weakness. The ancient wolf had not accepted a rider because the kingdom had been poisoned long before Alira arrived. It had been waiting. Below, Darian walked toward the prisoner pen. He looked at the villagers with a calm expression that made Alira fear him more than Roran. He spoke loudly enough for the camp to hear. The current king has forgotten his people. At dawn, the kingdom will need a leader who does not hesitate. Cale's hand closed around the stone ledge. Alira looked at him. What do we do? His eyes were dark now. The hurt had not vanished. It had turned into something sharper. We let them speak. She stared at him. Cale looked toward the camp. Let them believe their plan is working. Let every traitor stand where I can see them. The ancient wolf shifted beside him. Cale turned toward the old warriors. Move around the ravine. Find the lower path. Do not attack until you hear the horn. One warrior nodded. And the prisoners. They leave through the river pass, Cale said. Alira knows the trail. Alira looked at him. You want me to lead them out? I want you alive. The words struck her harder than she expected. Cale saw the change in her face, but he did not look away. You have carried the truth farther than anyone else. You will carry these people home. Alira shook her head. I cannot leave you here. You will not be leaving me. You will be taking away what they are using against me. The ancient wolf moved closer to Alira. Cale looked at the beast. Go with her. The wolf did not move. For one tense moment, Alira thought it would refuse him. Then the creature lowered its head toward Cale. Not a bow, a promise. The old warriors disappeared into the trees. Cale stayed near the ravine with only 3 men beside him. Alira moved down the narrow path with the ancient wolf at her side. The descent was steep and dangerous. Loose stones slid beneath her boots. The cold wind cut through her cloak. Yet her mind was clear. She knew the river pass. She knew the place where the guards changed shifts. She knew the old tunnel beneath the cliff where children used to hide during summer storms. When she reached the lower edge of the camp, she could hear the prisoners breathing behind the wooden pen. The ancient wolf moved silently through the shadows. Its white fur should have made it visible, but the snow and moonlight seemed to hide it. Alira reached the back wall of the pen. A woman inside saw her and covered her mouth to stop a cry. Alira pressed one finger to her lips. The ancient wolf placed its paw against the wooden stakes. The wood cracked. One stake broke free, then another. The prisoners stared in disbelief as an opening appeared. Alira whispered for them to move toward the river pass. No one ran at first. Fear had made them slow. Fear had taught them that every chance of escape could be another trap. Then Taryn's mother appeared from the crowd. Her face was bruised. Her hands were tied. When she saw Alira, tears filled her eyes. My son, she whispered. He is safe, Alira said. He is waiting for you. The woman nearly collapsed. That was enough. The prisoners began to move. One by one, they slipped through the opening and followed Alira toward the dark river path. The ancient wolf stayed behind them, guarding the escape. Then a voice rose from the camp. Stop them. Captain Roran had seen. The camp erupted. Red hollow wolves ran toward the pen. Torches swung through the darkness. Arrows cut through the air and struck the snow around Alira's feet. The prisoners screamed and began to run. The ancient wolf turned. Its roar shattered the night. It launched into the attackers with a force that sent 2 men crashing into the ground. Alira pushed the villagers toward the river pass. Behind her, the camp became chaos. Then a horn sounded from the ravine. One long note. Cale's signal. The forgotten warriors attacked from the shadows. They came down the cliffs and through the trees with no royal banners, no polished armor, and no fear left to hide. They struck the royal soldiers first. Men who had worn the king's mark turned against one another. The red hollow wolf shouted in confusion. Kale stepped into the center of the camp. He did not run. He did not hide. His sword was drawn, but he held it low at his side. Captain Roran saw him and froze. The king should have been trapped. He should have been weak. Instead, he stood beneath the burning torches with a storm behind him and the old warriors at his back. Kale's voice carried across the camp. Every man who carries my mark and stands with these wolves will be named traitor before the kingdom. Roran raised his sword. You have no kingdom left. Kale looked at him. Then why are you so afraid of me seeing this? Roran charged. The fight was fast. Kale moved with a force that made the soldiers around him stumble back. He blocked Roran's first strike, turned beneath the second, and drove his shoulder into the captain's chest. Roran fell into the snow. His sword slid from his hand. Kale placed the blade of his own sword against Roran's throat. The camp went silent around them. Roran looked up at him with hate. You were never meant to keep the throne. Kale leaned closer. Who decided that? Roran smiled through blood. Blood decided it. A horn sounded from the far side of the camp. Not Kale's horn. A darker sound. Darian's men were retreating toward the northern road. Kale looked up. The cloaked prince was gone. So was Lord Malrek. The enemy had left Roran behind. The captain understood it too late. Kale stepped away from him. Take him alive, he ordered. The old warriors bound Roran's hands. Alira reached the river pass with the last of the prisoners. She turned back toward the camp. The ancient wolf stood in the snow near Kale, its fur stained with ash and dark blood. The king looked toward the northern road where Darian had vanished. For one brief moment, Alira believed they had won. Then a rider came through the trees. He was one of Darius's men. His horse was shaking beneath him. His face was covered in snow and blood. He slid from the saddle and dropped to one knee before Kale. Your Majesty, he said, struggling for breath. The palace gates have been sealed. Kale's face hardened. The rider looked up. The council has declared you a traitor to the crown. And inside the palace, they have placed another man on your throne. The palace gates were sealed before the first light of dawn touched the mountains. From the eastern road, Alpha King Kale could see the black towers rising through the storm. The banners above them still carried the royal wolf symbol, but they no longer moved with pride in the wind. They hung stiff and dark against the stone, like mourning cloth over a grave. Behind Kale, the rescued villagers stood near the forest edge with Captain Darius and the forgotten warriors. They were exhausted, cold, and afraid, but they were alive. Mothers held their children close. Old men leaned against the shoulders of soldiers. The people who had been taken from their homes had returned with the truth in their eyes. The ancient wolf stood beside Alira. Its white fur was marked with ash from the enemy camp. Snow rested along its back. It stared at the palace gates without moving. The wolf had once been locked behind iron bars inside those walls. Now it looked at the place as if it remembered every betrayal that had happened there. Kale stood before the group with Captain Roran bound at his knees in the snow. The traitor captain had not spoken since they left the camp. His face was pale beneath the blood and dirt. He had watched the palace come into view, and the fear in his eyes had grown with every mile. Alira stepped beside Kale. What do we do now? She asked. The king looked at the gates. They believe I will attack them, he said. Darius frowned. They have the palace guard. The council controls the towers. If we charge the gates, we will lose men before we reach the first wall. Kale nodded. That is what they expect. Alira looked at him. Then what are you planning? Kale turned toward the villagers. The council wants the kingdom to believe I abandoned the eastern border. They want people to fear me. They want the palace to become a prison where only their version of the truth can survive. He looked toward Captain Roran. But they made one mistake. Roran lifted his head slowly. Kale stepped closer to him. They left witnesses alive. The rescued villagers watched the traitor captain with anger and pain. Some had lost homes. Some had lost family members. Some had been dragged through the snow by men wearing the king's mark. They had every reason to hate Kale because the enemy had used his name to destroy them. But now they stood before the real king. And he had come for them. Kale looked toward Darius. Send riders to every nearby village. Not soldiers in armor. Send the people who were taken. Let them speak. Let them tell the truth about the Red Wolves, the royal soldiers, and Captain Roran. Darius's eyes widened. You want the story to spread before the council can stop it. Kale looked toward the palace walls. I want the truth to reach the kingdom before their lies can become law. The old captain smiled, for the first time that night. The council thinks they have trapped you inside their story, he said. Kale's face remained cold. They forgot who built the kingdom outside these walls. The riders left before sunrise. They carried no royal orders. They carried no seals. They carried only witnesses. Mothers rode with children wrapped in blankets. Farmers rode with smoke still caught in their clothes. Old warriors rode beside them with weapons hidden beneath their cloaks. They went north and south through the villages. They told people what had happened at the river crossing. They told them that the king had come with 40 forgotten warriors while the council had hidden behind palace doors. They told them that Captain Roran had worn the royal mark while serving the enemy. They told them that the ancient wolf had run again. And every time they spoke of the wolf, people listened. Inside the palace, the council was already preparing its own story. Lady Seraphine stood in the throne hall beneath the silver banners. The braziers burned bright. The council members sat in their seats with forced confidence. Commander Varric stood beside the throne in ceremonial armor. Lord Malrek had returned before dawn, though his face was pale from the journey. At the top of the throne's steps sat Prince Darian. He wore a black crown that had belonged to Kale's grandfather. It was too old for him, too heavy and too large, but he wore it with a calm expression as though it had always been waiting for him. The palace guards stood in rows along the walls. Many of them looked uncertain. They had been told that Kale had betrayed the kingdom. They had been told that he had joined with the enemy at the eastern border. They had been told that Prince Darian had returned to save the throne from a weak king. But none of them had seen Kale betray anyone. They had only heard the council speak. Lady Seraphine stepped before the throne. The former king has abandoned his duty, she said. He has placed the kingdom at risk through reckless actions and secret alliances. Until the threat has passed, Prince Darian will guide the royal bloodline and restore order. Her voice moved through the hall. No one applauded. The silence made Varric's eyes narrow. He stepped forward. The palace must stand united, he said. Anyone who questions the council's decision will be treated as an enemy of the crown. That was when the great doors opened. Every guard turned. A messenger entered the hall, covered in snow and breathing hard. He fell to one knee before the throne. My lord, he said to Darian, the eastern villages are speaking against us. Malrek stood quickly. What are they saying? The messenger looked down. They say Alpha King Kale rescued the prisoners. They say Captain Roran was captured. They say royal soldiers were seen fighting beside Red Hollow. The throne hall became restless. Lady Seraphine's face remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her robe. Varric stepped toward the messenger. Who is spreading this? The messenger swallowed. The villagers themselves. The answer was dangerous because it could not be easily silenced. A council could destroy a report. It could arrest a soldier. It could lock a gate. But it could not stop frightened people from speaking to one another across roads, farms, markets, and winter fires. Darian leaned forward on the throne. Then we make them afraid to speak, he said. His voice was not loud. It was worse because it carried no doubt. Varric nodded. I will send soldiers to the outer villages. No, Lady Seraphine said. Everyone looked at her. She stood slowly. If we send soldiers now, it will confirm the story. The people will believe we are hiding something. Varric's eyes hardened. Then what do you suggest? Seraphine looked toward the closed palace doors. We bring Kale inside. We let him stand before the council. We make him answer for his actions. If he refuses, the kingdom will see him as a rebel. If he enters, we control the hall. Darian smiled faintly. And if he brings the wolf? Lady Seraphine's eyes lowered. Then the palace will remember why that beast was locked away. Outside the walls, Kale waited until the sun rose. The storm had weakened. Pale light spread over the snow. The palace gates remained closed, but the towers above them had changed. More guards stood along the walls. Archers watched the road. The council had prepared for a battle. Cale gave them none. He walked forward alone. Alira watched from the forest edge beside the ancient wolf. Her heart beat hard against her ribs. She wanted to call after him. She wanted to tell him that walking toward the gates alone was madness. But Cale did not look back. He carried no shield. He wore no crown. His sword remained in its sheath. When he reached the open ground before the palace, the guards raised their weapons. A voice called from the wall. "Alpha King Cale, you have been declared a traitor to the crown. Lay down your weapon and surrender."
Cale stopped.
The wind moved through his dark hair. Then he looked up. "You are standing beneath my banner," he said. "You are wearing my mark. And you are calling me a traitor because men who hid behind locked doors told you to." The guards did not answer. Cale's voice rose. "Look at the eastern road. Look at the smoke still rising from the villages. Ask yourselves who went there. Ask yourselves who carried the prisoners home. Ask yourselves why Captain Roran is bound outside these walls." The guards looked down. Behind Cale, Darius brought Roran forward. The traitor captain was forced to his knees in the snow. Cale looked toward the wall. This man served the enemy while wearing royal armor. He followed orders from inside this palace. If the council is innocent, let them open the gates and judge him before the kingdom. The silence stretched. Then one of the younger guards on the wall lowered his spear. Another guard looked toward him. The commander beside them shouted for them to hold position. But doubt had entered the wall. And once doubt entered, fear no longer belonged only to Cale. Inside the palace, Varric watched from the throne hall window. He saw the guards shifting. He saw the villagers gathering along the distant road. They had come from nearby farms and settlements. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Men and women stood beyond the forest edge. Some carried lanterns. Some carried tools. Some simply stood with their arms around their children. They were not an army. They were something more dangerous. They were witnesses. Varric turned toward Darian. "We should kill him now." Lady Seraphine stepped between them.
"No.
If he dies outside the gates, he becomes a martyr." Varric's hand closed into a fist. "Then we open the gates and finish this inside." Darian rose from the throne. His eyes were calm. "Open them." The palace gates began to move. The sound rolled across the snow like thunder. Alira felt the ancient wolf tense beside her. Its fur lifted along its back. The beast had waited for this moment longer than any living person understood. Cale stood still as the gates opened. Beyond them, the palace courtyard was filled with guards. At the far end, the throne hall doors stood open. Prince Darian waited inside. Cale walked through the gates. The guards did not attack him. They watched. Alira followed with the ancient wolf. Darius came behind them with the forgotten warriors and Captain Roran. The rescued villagers remained near the gates, but some stepped forward too. They had lost too much to stay outside now. The courtyard filled with silence. Then the ancient wolf crossed the threshold. The reaction was immediate. Guards stumbled back. Horses screamed from the stable yard. The old beast moved slowly through the courtyard, its white fur bright against the black stone. It did not snarl. It did not attack. It simply walked beside Alira. Every person watching understood that something ancient had returned to the palace. The throne hall doors stood open. Cale entered first. Darian sat on the throne. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The hall was full of guards, council members, servants, and nobles. Every face turned toward the two men who shared the same bloodline and wanted the same crown. Darian looked older than Cale, but not weaker. His scarred face held the confidence of someone who had spent years waiting for revenge. "You look tired, nephew," he said. Cale looked at the crown on Darian's head. "You look desperate." A murmur moved through the hall. Varric stepped forward. "You stand before the council as a traitor," he said. "You abandoned the palace. You gathered armed men without permission. You entered enemy territory without command." Cale looked at him. "And you opened the eastern border." Varric smiled slightly. "Can you prove it?" Darius pushed Captain Roran forward. The captain fell to his knees. Cale looked down at him. "Tell them." Roran's face was gray with fear. Varric stared at him. For a moment, the captain remained silent. Then he looked toward the villagers near the doors. He saw the people he had helped imprison. He saw Taryn's mother holding her son. He saw the old miller standing with blood still dried on his face. Roran lowered his head. Commander Varric ordered the border defenses moved, he said. Lord Malrek paid Red Hollow scouts. Prince Darien promised them land after the king was removed. The hall erupted. Varric stepped forward with fury in his eyes. Liar. Roran flinched. Cale's voice cut through the noise. Continue. Roran looked toward Lady Seraphine. She knew, he said. She told us the council would protect us when the new king took the throne. Lady Seraphine's calm expression finally cracked. You fool, she whispered. The nobles began speaking at once. Guards looked toward one another. The palace had been built on order. Now that order was breaking apart in front of everyone. Darien rose from the throne. His voice filled the hall. Do you think one frightened captain changes anything? Cale has failed this kingdom for years. He has allowed weak packs to question the crown. He has let the ancient wolf become a symbol of decay. He has stood alone while the kingdom needed strength. Cale looked at him. You are right about one thing. Darien paused. I stood alone. Cale turned toward the people in the hall. I stood alone because I believed a king had to carry every burden himself. I believed silence was strength. I believed patience would protect the kingdom from chaos. His eyes moved toward the council. But silence gave traitors room to grow. The hall became quiet again. Cale looked at the guards. You do not have to follow me because I wear a crown. You do not have to follow me because my blood is royal. Follow the truth you have seen. Follow the people you swore to protect. Choose whether this palace belongs to a council of liars or to the kingdom beyond these walls. No one moved. Then the young guard from the wall stepped forward. He removed the council ribbon from his armor and dropped it onto the floor. I serve the king who went to the border, he said. Another guard stepped forward. Then another. Soon the sound of metal striking stone filled the hall as guards removed the ribbons and marks that showed loyalty to the council. Varric's face became pale. The power he had built through fear was leaving him one person at a time. Darien looked around the hall and understood that the throne beneath him had become empty. His hand moved toward the sword at his side. The ancient wolf growled. The sound shook the braziers. Darien froze. The wolf walked forward. It passed Alira. It passed Cale. It climbed the steps toward the throne. Every person in the hall stopped breathing. For 270 years, the royal wolf had refused every rider. For 270 years, it had not bowed to any king. Now it stood before Darien. The prince tried to hold its gaze. He failed. The wolf bared its teeth. Darien stepped backward. The black crown slipped from his head and struck the stone floor. The sound echoed through the throne hall. The ancient wolf placed one massive paw over the crown. Then it turned toward Cale. For a long moment, the king did not move. Alira watched him. She knew this was more than a beast choosing a rider. It was more than an old symbol returning to the royal bloodline. It was a judgment. Cale walked toward the throne. The wolf lowered its body. The hall gasped. It had not done this for any warrior in centuries. Cale placed one hand against the wolf's neck. The beast did not flinch. Then Cale turned and looked at Alira.
Come here, he said.
Alira's breath caught. She stepped forward slowly. The wolf looked at her with the same deep storm gray eyes it had shown her at the palace gate. It lowered its head beside her hand. Cale looked at the crowd. This wolf did not return because of my crown, he said. It returned because she carried the truth when everyone else tried to bury it. Alira felt every eye in the hall turn toward her. She wanted to step back, but Cale's expression stopped her. It was not command. It was respect. The king lifted the black crown from beneath the wolf's paw. He did not place it on his own head. Instead, he held it out toward the guards. Take this crown to the fire, he said. Let no traitor wear the symbol of my family again. Darien's face twisted with rage. You cannot erase blood. Cale looked at him.
No.
But I can erase your power. Varric suddenly reached for his sword. The forgotten warriors moved first. Darius struck Varric's arm aside. The commander fought with the desperation of a man who knew his empire had ended. He pushed one warrior away and turned toward the side doors. But the ancient wolf was faster. It stepped into his path. Varric stopped. The beast did not attack him. It only stared. That was enough. The commander dropped his sword. Lady Seraphine lowered her head. Lord Malrek tried to run, but the guard seized him before he reached the doors. Darian stood alone beside the throne, surrounded by the ruin of his plan. Cale looked toward Darius.
Take them all.
The guards obeyed. As the traitors were led away, the palace hall slowly began to breathe again. The villagers stepped farther inside. The nobles who had remained silent lowered their eyes. The old warriors stood with their shoulders straight, no longer forgotten. Alira remained beside the ancient wolf. Cale came to stand near her. The kingdom will need to know what happened here, he said. Alira looked toward the throne. Will they believe it? Cale looked at the open doors, where dawn light had begun to enter the hall. They will believe what they see us build next. Outside, the first sunlight touched the palace walls. For the first time in years, the royal banners moved freely in the wind. Cale walked toward the courtyard. The ancient wolf lowered itself beside him. Alira stood at its side. Then the Alpha King placed his hand on the wolf's neck and climbed onto its back. The hall fell silent. The wolf rose beneath him. It was not a symbol anymore. It was a promise. Cale looked down at Alira. The eastern border needs a voice the people trust, he said. Ride with me. Alira looked at the wolf. Then she looked at the king. For 270 years, no rider had run beside the ancient beast. Now the wolf lowered its head toward her. Alira placed her hand in Cale's. Together, they climbed onto the back of the royal wolf. The gates opened wide. The Alpha King rode into the morning with the girl who had carried the truth, while the ancient wolf ran beneath them like a storm finally set free. Behind them, the palace stood silent. Ahead of them, the kingdom waited. And far beyond the northern mountains, hidden beneath the shadow of an old ruined fortress, a pair of pale eyes watched the royal wolf run. A voice spoke from the darkness. The wolf has chosen again. Then the unseen figure smiled. And this time, the real war will begin.